The first Afghan opium crop of the year is being planted right now, a legacy of a war that cost more than 10,000 British servicemen and women dead or wounded. No one counted the Afghans. 70,000 people a year in the UK get criminal records for drug possession. And MPs on Thursday met Mexican politicians to learn from their experience of lethal drug cartels and mass beheadings. Journalist, author and Russell Brand's producer Johann Hari has just written Chasing the Scream, endorsed by, among others, Noam Chomsky, Elton John and Stephen Fry. He joins me now. Welcome, Johann Hari, to Going Underground. We probably know it's quite likely that David Cameron's cabinet, some of them have taken drugs. Why do you think they haven't amended drug policy since the coalition came to power?
There isn't a big enough movement to pressure them to do it. They're scared of the Daily Mail. Actually, intellectually, when you speak to them, not all of them, but a lot of them have basically similar views to me. But there's not a big enough movement, and we haven't persuaded people enough yet that the alternatives are not what they fear they are. There are ideas from the drug war that everyone, including me when I was growing up, even though I was growing up with addiction in my family, just take for granted. And one of the things that most struck me, when I realised we were coming up to the centenary of the drug war, there were loads of really basic questions that I realised I just didn't know the answer to. Like, why were drugs banned? Why did we go to war against drug users and drug addicts 100 years ago? Why do we carry on even though a lot of people think it doesn't work? What are the real alternatives? How do they work in practice? And what really causes drug use and drug addiction? And part of the problem about the whole way we debate this, I think, is we talk about it in such abstract terms as if we're all at a philosophy seminar. I didn't want to do that. I wanted to go and see how this affects real people in their real lives all over the world.
One of the key figures in this book that keeps reappearing is this figure, Hari Anslinger, who you credit with actually changing drug laws here in Britain, let alone the United States. Tell us about him.
Hari Anslinger is the most influential person who no one's ever heard of. He's the inventor of the modern drug war. He took over the Department of Prohibition in the United States just as alcohol prohibition is ending. So he's a government bureaucrat with a big demoralised department and nothing to do. And Hari Anslinger was really a kind of genius. He was motivated by two really strong hatreds. Hatred of addicts and hatred of African Americans. And he managed to fuse these together. I tell this in the book through the story of how he stalked and killed Billie Holiday, the great jazz singer. In 1939, she stands on stage in New York City and she sings the song Strange Fruit, a song against lynching. And that night, Hari Anslinger his men order her to stop singing this song. You know, the idea of a black woman singing about lynching was horrifying to him. He knew she was a heroin addict. She refused. She effectively said, screw you, I'm an American citizen, I'll do what I want. And that's when the stalking of her begins that leads to them effectively killing her. Well, and I think that tells you a huge amount about the dynamics behind the drug war. Partly that it was largely motivated then and now by race, and partly tells us what we do to addicts.
She came to London and she said she was impressed by drugs, the attitude to drugs in terms of the British criminal justice system. What went wrong? I mean, you talk about the 60s being...
Yeah. So Anslinger manages to impose on... Basically, Anslinger uses American diplomatic might at the end of the Second World War to force the entire world to fight the drug war the American way. Loads of countries didn't want to do it. Countries like Thailand just said, we're not doing it. And the Americans threatened to cut off the aid. Mexico refused to do it. With Britain, it's very interesting. Britain was one of the last countries to hold out, and particularly concerning heroin. British doctors, the British government tried to deal with them, but British doctors, to their huge credit, said, look, heroin addicts are unwell, they need love and support and compassion, and most importantly, they need a prescription of heroin, right? So from the 1920s, when everywhere else is banning it, right up to the 90s, Britain is the absolute holdout country which carried on prescribing heroin. And the results were really extraordinary. If you look at the places, I tell this through the story of an incredible doctor called Dr. John Marks in the Wirral in the north of England, who arrives in the Wirral in the early 1980s, discovers to his surprise they're prescribing heroin to addicts, thinks this is a bad idea until he meets the heroin addicts and realises they're nothing like any heroin addict he's ever seen anywhere. They've had jobs, they didn't have any abscesses, they didn't have any wounds. Because if you prescribe heroin to people legally, as I saw in the clinics in Switzerland where they do this, if you prescribe heroin to people legally, loads of the things that we think are the result of heroin addiction are in fact the result of criminalised heroin addiction.
On the Liverpool example, as you say, it had great success. And you say that an interview on 60 Minutes on American TV meant that Americans were calling the British government, this during the Thatcher years maybe, or Major, saying, get rid of this doctor, get rid of this program, stop the program.
Dr. John Marks and his colleagues go to America and start talking about this program and say, you know, look, this would work pretty well, you know, they're compassionate people, this would work pretty well anywhere. And the Americans massively pressure the British government to stop. At the moment, the standout disaster countries are Russia, China, and some other Asian countries like Thailand. If you look at Russia, for example, has one of the worst HIV crises in the world, and it's overwhelmingly driven by intravenous drug use.
You do keep referring to this idea that addiction is not chemically deterministic, that it's actually austerity.
This is one of the things that most surprised me. If you'd said to me 4 years ago, what causes, say, heroin addiction, I would have looked at you like you were a little bit simple-minded, and I would have said, well, heroin causes heroin addiction, right? First thing that led me to the fact that may not be right was when I interviewed a guy called Gabor Mate, a doctor in Vancouver, who explained to me, if we step out onto the street after this interview and we're hit by a car on Millbank, right, God forbid, and, we break our hips, we'll be taken to whatever it is, St Thomas's Hospital, we'll be given loads of diamorphine. Diamorphine is heroin. It's much better heroin than you would score on the streets near here because it's medically pure. If what we believe about addiction is right, I mean, you'll be given that diamorphine for quite a long time. If what we believe about addiction is right, what should happen? We should leave hospital as heroin addicts. You will have noticed that virtually never happens. Your grandmother was not turned into a junkie by her hip operation. So something else is going on there, and I didn't really know what to do with that. It seemed so strange until I went and interviewed a guy called Professor Bruce Alexander in Vancouver, an extraordinary man, who did a really important experiment that's subsequently been proven in other ways.
We'll have to speed through it with the rats.
Sure, with the rats, very quickly. Idea of addiction we have comes from experiments we've done early in the 20th century, really simple experiments. You get a rat, you put it in a cage, it's got 2 water bottles. One is just water, other is water laced with heroin or cocaine. If you do that, the rat always prefers the drugged water, almost always kills itself. There you are, that's our theory of addiction. Bruce comes along in the 70s and says, hang on a minute, we're putting the rat in an empty cage, it's got nothing to do.
It's in solitary confinement.
Yeah, let's try this differently. So Bruce builds Rat Park. Rat Park is like heaven for rats. Anything a rat could want, it's got cheese and coloured balls, it can have loads of sex, it's got loads of friends, and it's got both the water bottles. But what's fascinating is, in Rat Park, they don't like the drugged water. They hardly ever use it. None of them ever use it compulsively. None of them ever overdose. Now, there's human examples we can talk about, but what Bruce says is not immorality, it's not your brain, it's your cage.
Okay, but then are we in a perfect storm here? Because we've got massive austerity going through Europe, let alone in Britain, and at the same time we have ever more opiates coming from the wars in Afghanistan. Are we in line now for a real epidemic of drug abuse? Because the government, as Norman Baker, the drugs minister, alleges, says suppress reports into Switzerland and Portugal. This is right.
And it's very important. It's interesting you talk about Portugal. I spent time in Portugal. I think the story of what happened in Portugal is one of the most important things for people to understand. In the year 2000, Portugal had one of the worst drug problems in Europe. 1% of the population was addicted to heroin, which is mind-blowing. Every year they tried the American Russian Chinese way more and more. They arrested more people, imprisoned more people, cracked down harder, and every year the problem got worse. One day the Prime Minister and the leader of the opposition got together and did something really bold. They said, look, we can't go on like this. Let's set up a panel to figure out what will genuinely deal with this problem, and let's agree in advance.
And as you say, they've made this huge stride. It's the first time in Europe.
They decriminalised all drugs, but
the government here says, oh look, but drug use has gone up in Portugal.
No, this is really important to understand. What they did in Portugal was they transferred all the money they used to spend on arresting drug users, imprisoning drug users, all of that, and spent it all on extremely good drug treatment. It's really important. The results are in now. It's been nearly 15 years since this experiment began. Injecting drug use is down by 50% in Portugal, 50%. Compare that to what we were just saying about the US and Britain, where they're significantly rising. Overall addiction is down, overdose is massively down, HIV transmission is massively down.
If we don't take some of the measures that you imply we need to take here in Britain, what's going to happen as regards drug abuse in Britain?
A whole series of tragedies. The worst tragedy will be that the drug trade will continue to be controlled by armed criminal gangs who fight and stab each other and anyone who gets in their way. So there's that. We'll continue to have massive and unnecessary levels of overdose, death. Far more people's lives, like my relatives, will be ruined through addiction that could actually be turned around if we had a Portuguese model. And we'll continue to destroy supply route countries like Mexico. None of these tragedies have to happen. Of course, there'll still be some tragedies after we move towards a sensible policy, but we can massively reduce them. The one thing you can say for the drug war is we gave it a fair shot. We've done this for 100 years. There is an alternative. This is not an abstract argument. There are alternatives that have been tried all over the world that are working incredibly well. We can choose them, but it'll only happen if we have a mass movement of ordinary people demanding it.
Johann Hari, thank you.